Aloha, everyone, and good afternoon for everyone here in Hawaii. My name is Anna Page. I'm the Director of Programming at the Hawaii International Film Festival, and I want to welcome you this afternoon to our Film for Thought discussion with Loira Limbal, Director of Through the Night, and Elizabeth Colwell, our Film for Thought scholar for today's discussion. I'm just going to go over some housekeeping bits before we get started. First of all, this film, as I mentioned, is part of our Film for Thought program in partnership with the Hawaii Council for the Humanities. We are incredibly grateful for the support of the Hawaii Council for the Humanities, without which this program truly would not be possible. If you are just tuning in to your first Film for Thought discussion here at HIFF, we have 4 wonderful discussions happening throughout the week. 2 of them have passed. You can watch them recorded on our HIFF Facebook, and we'll have another discussion for the film Dawn a Dark Stairwell on Sunday. You can find the full information about all of our Film for Thought films and our discussions on our website at hiff.org, and also on our Spotlights page. You can find out more about the program. As part of this program, you can also read a companion essay available on our website by Elizabeth Colwell about the film. So please check that out if you have not already after the discussion. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Liz Soto from the Hawaii Council for the Humanities to say a few words about this year's program and to introduce our speakers.
Aloha. Thank you, Anna. I just want to offer a huge thank you to HIFF for all their work with the festival, celebrating 40 years this year, 40 festivals, and this year in particular, to have made this happen, giving people the ability to watch the wealth of all these beautiful films in ways that also make them feel safe and cared for. Hawaii Council for the Humanities is especially grateful for our Film for Thought collaboration with HIFF, now in its 11th year. Well before our pandemic hit, the team at Hawaii International Film Festival suggested we return to our theme of change makers for 2020. Now, here we are going through so much extraordinary and in many cases unexpected change. We couldn't be more grateful for the loving, unflinching intensity that each of these films dares to hold. Through the Night, the center for today's panel, helps us see the broken nature of our labor and childcare systems and the tenacity of loving hands. At Hawaii Council for the Humanities, we find hope in these 3 central beliefs for the Film for Thought program. 1, it matters when we listen to difficult and challenging stories without looking away. 2, it matters that we support this kind of courageous and committed filmmaking. And 3, it matters when we come together to not just watch these films, but also to talk about them together. What happens to us when we enter deeply and compassionately into another person's story? It's a real pleasure for me to introduce the panelists today. Through the Night's director, Loira Limbal, is an Afro-Dominican filmmaker and DJ interested in the creation of art that is nuanced and revelatory for communities of color. She is the Senior Vice President of Programs at Firelight Media. Firelight is committed to making films about pivotal movements and moments in the US. Firelight's flagship program, the Documentary Lab, is a fellowship that provides mentorship, funding, and industry access to emerging filmmakers for color. And there are several Firelight media panels and talk story events that are part of HIFF this year, and everyone should definitely check those out. Limbal's Through the Night is a feature documentary about a 24-hour daycare center. Through the Night was part of the 2019 Sundance Edit and Story Lab and was selected for world premiere at the 2020 Tribeca Film Festival. Her first film, Estilo Hip Hop, was a co-production of ITVS and aired on PBS in 2009. She's a Sundance Institute Fellow and a former Ford Foundation Just Film Rock Fellows, and she lives in the Bronx with her 2 children. So thank you for all your amazing work and for being here today, Loira. Our Film for Thought scholar is Elizabeth Colwell, an Associate Professor of American Studies and an affiliate graduate faculty in the Department of Women's Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. She takes inspiration from many generations of activist women, including working mothers. And I want to add a thank you to Elizabeth for giving us such a thoughtful and moving essay in response to Through the Night. And another mahalo nui to you both for being here with us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz. I just want to say how delighted I am to be here with all of you. Thank you to Hawaii Council for Humanities. Thank you to HIFF. And especially thank you to Loira for being here with me today. I want to start out just by saying that if you haven't yet seen Loira's most recent film, Through the Night, you must do it. It tells the story of a 24-hour childcare center in New Rochelle, New York. And it follows the children's caretakers, Dolores Hogan and her husband, Patrick, through their days and nights. And it reveals these nurturing relationships among caretakers and mothers and the children, shining a light on the value of that often invisible labor, but also on its great costs, because if this film is about intimacy and loving relationships, it also exposes a social crisis. And that is the pain that is inflicted on families trapped in low-wage part-time jobs and working many, many hours, and the disproportionate burden of that pain borne by Black and Latinx mothers and their children in this film. So thank you so very much for being here today. So I just wanted to launch right in by saying that it struck me the first time I've watched this film, and I've seen it 3 times. I love it so much. It's a film about relationships, and those relationships develop over time. And it strikes me that you must have built relationships with the people in the film over time as well to create such an intimate film. So I wanted to ask you to talk about your inspiration for the film and how you met Dolores and Patrick.
Yes, and hello everyone. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you to everyone at HIFF, especially to my dear friends Kiara Lacey and Lori Sumeye, who are part of the Firelight family. And to you, Elizabeth, I read your essay one morning, and it actually moved me to tears. So thank you for taking the time to write that piece. It was very moving and very compelling to me. And yes, to answer your question, I met Nunu and Patrick. Well, I learned about their daycare through an article that I read about their daycare. They were featured in a piece, and about 2 years after initially when I read the article, I immediately sort of brought back to my own childhood. I was raised by a single working mother who worked the night shift. My mother worked as a home health aide, and reading the article, I just immediately recalled so many moments, and challenges and just difficulties of my mother's experience, and then it kind of put me in this very reflective space because I now myself am a working single mother, and so it just opened up, this whole kind of reflection on this universe. And I said, well, this would be a great film because this is so many people's story, but we don't really see the story anywhere. I certainly don't feel like I've seen, many films that focus on this universe. And for many reasons, I sat on the idea. 2 years later, I cold called Nunu after trying to convince myself that I couldn't make the film precisely because I am a working single mother. I was like, you don't have time. You have no business trying to be in production. But the idea wouldn't leave me alone. And so I would, think about things that I would do if I were shooting the film. I might do this, or I might do that while I was doing dishes and things like that. So long story short, I cold call, they take a meeting. They invite me in for a meeting. We spent a few hours together, and Nunu said, yeah, let's do this. And it's become a really important relationship and part of my life.
I'm so glad that idea didn't let you go. because you created a beautiful film out
me
of
too.
it. You know, some of the things that struck me immediately were just the visual beauty of the intimacy that you created in the film. And a shout out to the director of photography there, Naida Gomez, if I have that right.
Naiti Gomez, yes.
Naiti, sorry. Yeah, just beautifully done. And to you, of course. And also to the fact that it struck me that you highlighted the words of the children and the mothers and of Nunu and Patrick all the way through that film, that you really foregrounded their vision. And I wanted to ask you to speak a little bit about those kinds of decisions and why you made those decisions as a director.
It's a universe that I feel like is the universe that raised me and the world of all of my peers. As someone who was raised in a low-income, working-class community in the Bronx, right? So this is kind of my world. And, it was a matter of really, there was no need to interpret anything in terms of, what I was trying to show on camera. I was, my goal was actually to sort of document, but more sort of behold, kind of create a space for us to be able to really just sit and behold our own experiences, our everyday, in a way that felt patient and curious, especially within a context where kind of breath and rest and reflection is something that is denied to people of color in this country. I wanted the film to sort of feel like I capture the very deep interdependence that exists in our communities and reflect back the interdependence that has kept our communities alive, which right now with the pandemic, there's this popularity of the words mutual aid and solidarity and these things, but for communities that have been living kind of social collapse for a very long time, communities for whom the systems of this country do not work and actually work to harm them, mutual aid is something that we've been practicing all along, so there's this genius that I'm trying to make legible to us that is our genius, but again, does not get spoken about in those terms.
Yes, absolutely. And that's so beautifully said. It connects with something else that I wanted to go into a little bit more deeply. That's a beautiful bridge to it, in fact, which is that it seems like the film pushes back against certain kinds of representations of motherhood and mothering. On the one hand, against the invisibility of real mothers and their work, and on the other hand, a kind of a hyper visibility of women of color in dominant media in terms of victimization and violence, with mothers of color being represented as victims or villains. And it felt like, what you were just saying a moment ago about really holding space and showing these communities of care that have been in place for a very long time because there wasn't anybody else going to do it, right? Is such a powerful vision of care and of community to reflect back to the community itself. Yeah, just really beautiful. I mean, there are also these really wonderful moments of humor. I keep wanting to describe the whole film to you people who are in the audience somehow, but there are these really wonderful moments. Like one of them, I guess I wrote about in the little piece that I wrote. But there's this preschooler who says, "Patrick, you are the king of the house," and this other preschooler pipes up, and this is a girl, and she says, "No, Nunu's the queen of the house too." And Nunu comes back and she says, "Actually, I'm the king and the queen. Here's the prince." And they're just, just the playfulness and the laughter and the warmth and the love comes through in every single scene of that film. It's just so moving and so powerful. And so, it brought me to thinking about storytelling, Loira, and just what happens when mothers get together, and you show that in the film. Mothers talk to each other. They talk to each other about the hard stuff, and they talk to each other about the fun stuff and the beautiful stuff and the moments of intimacy. And the stories just start to flow. And lots of times we're just talking about the detail. I'm a mother too, by the way. And lots of time we're just talking about the details of daily life, but we're constantly told that these things are insignificant, right? And then even the bigger stuff is oftentimes seen as insignificant. When your kid is sick and you don't have family in town and you don't have anywhere to take them. I mean, in our, excuse me, I'm so sorry. In our family, it was like, after 2 Christmases and a New Year's at the ER, we figured maybe we should just make a reservation there in advance for, any holiday coming up, because we had a lot of sickness that we were dealing with. And, but mothers' stories, the point that I'm making is that mothers' stories tend to be relegated to the realm of the personal rather than the realm of the political. But they're not just personal stories. In fact, they say a whole lot about society. And those stories of mothering are not all the same, because the costs and the burdens of mothering and caretaking in our own society are not equally shared among women, all women, as you were just very clearly saying. And so, the issue of whether your kid doesn't want to put on their socks versus the issue of putting food on the table, those are really significant differences. And so I wanted to go more to that issue of the realities of that juggle of labor and care in Black and Latinx communities in this world of inequality and systemic racism. I mean, what are the particular ways that people sustain themselves, but also the particular ways that life has been made more difficult than it needs to be, precisely because we lack the infrastructure, we lack the support, et cetera. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've said so much. In some ways, I feel like you might have answered your own question. But I think our existence in this society, I'll just say, like, one of my goals is that I hope we can start talking about capitalism more directly and more specifically.
Mm-hmm.
I think we kind of dance around the term in this country. We have a lot of sophisticated language around democracy. Now we have very sophisticated language around race and issues. And, capitalism is the foundation, right, of it's the actual system that we live in. I would say much more than a democracy, right? This is some sort of oligarchy that we're living in. And yet it's able to kind of wreak this havoc that it does on the lives of poor and working class people, precisely because it's invisible. So it's like pervasive, it informs everything, it's the very foundation of everything, but it's not ever questioned, it's not ever exposed, it's not ever explicitly dissected. And I do hope someone like Marisol, who is working 3 jobs because none of her employers want to give her full-time hours so that they don't, right? And it's of that dance, and of having in some ways to choose between, do you provide financially, or do you provide emotionally and physically with your presence, and not being able to do the two, or even when you think of someone like Shanona, who is a pediatric ER nurse, she is not working a low wage job, but she's a single mother who needs nighttime care. We don't have any supports for that, right? And so because we don't, many folks are put into situations where they have to make very, sometimes dangerous and impossible decisions. In Shanona's case, obviously she has Lulu and Patrick, and the children are safe and loved. Not everyone has that, right? And she's also exhausted. Lulu and Patrick are amazing, but nobody in this film is sleeping anything more than 3 or 4 hours. So, I want us to collectively question, like, how is it okay that we are here where sleep, a basic necessity, has been turned into a luxury that only, the select few have access to? Sleep deprivation is tantamount to torture, right? And so, and this happens every day, and no one thinks about it, no one questions it, and I that's, what I'm hoping to foreground, so that we see the absurdity, the violence, and the cruelty of, the acts of violence, right? But these sort of normal, quote unquote, everyday, mundane systems and routines and norms, you know, that we have collectively normalized. I want us to not normalize them, right?
Yes, yes, absolutely. So sorry, the internet connection isn't great, but I think that what I grasped is that the normalization of a society in which people are, women in particular, but many people are working longer and longer and longer hours is a kind of brutalization of existence that forces women into these choiceless choices in which they have to sacrifice one thing or another, and usually themselves and that's what, if I understood everything that you were conveying. And that comes through so powerfully in the film, because you see the exhaustion and you see the sorrow that goes along with that, you know, the wanting to be more present. In one case, I forget which woman it is right now, but one of the children actually ages out of daycare and can no longer go to daycare. Could you tell that story a little bit and why that's such a dilemma?
Yes, sure. Yeah, so that's Marisol, you know, her daughter, she has two daughters. Yes, and her eldest turns 13, and that's the point at which you are no longer eligible for subsidies to help pay for daycare, which Marisol relies on. But she's working, you know, irregular schedules. One day she works till 10 p.m. at night. The next day she might work till 12 a.m. or 1 a.m., which are not appropriate or adequate hours to leave a 13-year-old home alone, right? And so the dilemma for her is like, I can't leave my 13-year-old home alone at 12 a.m., but I have to work to put food on the table, right? And that, you know, that I love your phrase of choiceless choices, because that's exactly what it is, you know, and that's violence, that's harm. And that's harm that we have just normalized and we are all okay with. And, you know, you said something earlier also about the kind of common portrayals of especially Black and Latina women in the United States. And, you know, there's the victim sort of trope, right, and narrative, which is obviously problematic and reductive. But on the other hand, there's this sort of hero trope, where, you know, right now, especially in the light of the elections, you know, Black women save the day, and there's these empty sort of compliments and empty celebrations, yet nobody cares what those Black women who, you know, saved quote unquote democracy, what their everyday looks like. You know, no one's thinking about who is supporting them, who is taking care of them. And that's what I care about. You know, I care about what their experience is like, what our experience is like, how we feel, what we need. You know, I think it's lazy and you know, it's like a lazy entitlement to reduce, you know, women of color to either victims or heroes, right? Because then that lets us off the hook from having to kind of sit with and grapple with the complexity of everyday life.
And when we think then about government and its failure of responsibility, there's so many things that we could say in relation to what you just said. I mean, all the way back to the 1993 Family Medical Leave Act, which does not provide paid medical leave, as anyone in the audience probably already knows. And so by definition, that act is only for the wealthy, only those who could afford to take time off. And we are truly an exceptional country among developed countries in this world of refusing to provide paid leave for families, for parents, when their children are born, or for various kinds of caretaking paid leave. We're really the exception, and that's something to think about so deeply. What does it mean to pay homage to, as you just said, Black women for just electing Biden when there are no supports put in place? The other thing I was just thinking about is that I was reading recently that motherhood is a real predictor of wage inequality, and even greater predictor of wage inequality than gender alone. And when motherhood and race are put together, then that's the setup then in a certain way for poverty. So it seemed to me that your film your film is so brilliant because it doesn't explicitly state some of the things that nonetheless come through so powerfully and so clearly. Things like, well, then, what needs to be done to create a humane society, to create a society in which caretaking is valued in every possible respect, is visible, valued, and in which women don't have to live those long and exhausting hours that you so vividly depict there. So if, I guess if I were just to ask you then, so what are you saying about American society in terms of kind of puncturing some of the myths about American society, or just simply suggesting what might we do to make things different? How might we change that scenario?
Yeah, I think a lot about, as a filmmaker and as a cultural worker overall, I think a lot about my work functioning in the space of imagination. So, to start from the place of, you see a community like the community that Nunu and Patrick have nurtured for over 2 decades. I want to see centers of care for all of the most vulnerable people in our communities throughout the country. That's work that we can do, right? That's not even, government level work. That's work that we can do, right? It's like, again, that piece of like re-signifying what is actually essential and what is actually also what's actually radical and what's revolutionary, and I think we are in the US in terms of movement spaces, we're very enamored with the fight. We're not as enamored with care or caregiving or nurturing, which are the things that have actually quite literally kept us alive. And so I'm hoping that we can shift our imagination and we can make caregiving be this thing that's seen as irresistible, not this burden that you have to do, but this thing that you want to do and that we're all capable of doing, and that is perhaps the most radical thing that you can do in a society that our bodies are valueless, that we are worthless, that if we say no and we say no actively by caring for ourselves and one another, that to me is probably like the peak of subversion, right? And of resisting the narratives that this country puts forth, so that's one piece, is this piece around imagination. And also for us to see like Nunu and Patrick are very gifted people who are walking their purpose and their calling. That, we can't all be Nunu and Patrick's, but they become this tangible model of, like, what if the country was run like Nunu's daycare? There are children of all ages, of different races, coming from different family backgrounds and situations, different socioeconomic, situations, different abilities, different issues, different challenges, and everyone is cared for. Right? Everyone receives what they need. And it's not simple. I don't mean to romanticize anything, but it is possible. And I want us to sort of rethink what we think is possible, so that when we are thinking about change, we don't limit ourselves to reforming systems that were created to do harm, that we can think about abolition and reparations and sovereignty, right? And these big things that we're told are too radical, to work, and that we have to think smaller and we have to, be incremental and all of these things. Like, I want us to liberate our imaginations, right? And dream much bigger and want much more for ourselves and each other.
And it's so eloquently said. And I just wanted to bring up that on Friday, November 20th, I know you're continuing this conversation on Black, Latinx, and Polynesian caregiving. And I want to point out that in Hawaii, a conversation has been going on for centuries, indeed, about caregiving, and especially within Kanaka communities who have a tradition of shared care for children and for kupuna or elders. And that conversation will be continuing with you at that time. We'll put the with a link, I'm sure, that in the chat or something, so that everybody can see it. But I just noticed a question from a Facebook viewer, and it says, "Your film captures a stillness. It elevates the silent dignity of women, especially BIPOC women, as the backbone of society and economy. Can you talk about the construction of the film, and was this a deliberate choice, or did the tone come naturally from the footage that was shot?"
I think that's a great question, and those are all very beautiful words. Thank you. I think it's a combination. The tone of the film was, I would say, mostly determined by the footage itself. There were things that we wanted to do. My editor, Malika Zuhali Waral, and we had these, sort of big ideas about formal, things that we wanted to experiment with. And oftentimes when we tried them, they felt like heavy-handed, like almost like, when you have like a delicate flower and you're like overdoing it, you're overwatering it. We constantly kind of had to pull back because the footage was telling us like what it wanted to be. That was one part of it. The other part of the tone, I do think, is connected to the rhythm of the film, which we actually, the pace and the rhythm, which we actually had a very difficult time landing on. We tried lots of things. At one point, the film moved even slower than it currently does, and then at another point, it was like super fast and it's like compact. And neither extreme felt right. And so we kind of just kept experimenting until we finally landed on breath, of all things, as our kind of metronome. So Malika and I, the editor, would literally sit in the edit. And when we were trying to figure out how long to hold a shot, especially in transitions and things like that, or where to end something, like where the natural kind of, came from, we would sit and kind of tap on the table like a metronome, but connected to just like taking deep breaths and be like, okay, we got to complete that breath and now we can move on. So it's kind of a combination of some, stuff that she and I made up and the footage telling us what it wanted to be.
I truly believe that if you listen closely enough to that film, everyone in the audience can hear that breath. The rhythm unfolds perfectly, just so beautiful. I'm realizing that we're at the point when you need to go. You have another meeting with Nunu and Patrick themselves at this time, and that's a wonderful way to say goodbye. Then I can't thank you enough for being here with us today, Loira, and really appreciate it. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Really enjoyed the conversation, and thank you, Anna, and everyone at HIFF for having me.
Thank you so much again. I just want to extend a special mahalo to you, Loira, for this beautiful film, and to Elizabeth for hosting this wonderful discussion. And before we go, again, another huge mahalo to Hawaii Council for the Humanities, to their team, Aiko, Liz, and Shannon, who have really helped put together these wonderful conversations this week. As a reminder, we are still having our HIFF Audience Award this year. So if you would like to vote for this film for the HIFF Audience Award, you can go to hawaiinewsnow.com/HIFF to cast your vote. And just another huge mahalo to all of our sponsors, our HIFF Ohana members, and our board of directors who help HIFF happen. Thank you so much. And if you really enjoyed this conversation, please check out our other Film for Thought conversations. Please check out the Way Forward panel series, all free, coming this week, featuring Loira on our caregiving panel discussion. So please definitely check those out. They're going to be really incredible. And lastly, just one plug before you go. If you love HIFF, if you love conversations like this, please consider donating today for our HIFF40 for 40 campaign. You can find more information about that at hiff.org. Mahalo again to our speakers, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
Mahalo.